Hi, everyone. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism. And on behalf of YIPSA, the Whitney Humanities Center, and the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures at Yale, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today to our Benjamin and Barbara Zucker lecture series. Today's speaker, Alex Ross, a fellow Harvard 90 alum, has written about music for the New York Times, the New Republic, the London Review of Books, among many other publications, and he's been the music critic of the New Yorker magazine since the 1990s. Alex has won a slew of major prizes, including the MacArthur Genius Grant. His first book, The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, was published in 2007 and won the National Book Critics Circle Award, was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and was named one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. His second book, Listen to This, a collection of his essays, was published in 2010, and his new book, right here, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, from which his talk today is drawn, was published last year. This book took more than a decade of work, but it's really amazing that it didn't take even longer. Alex has seemingly tracked down every reference to Wagner in literature, art, dance, philosophy, you name it, over the past 150 years and in every major European language. As he puts it on page 15, the book has socialist Wagner, feminist Wagner, gay Wagner, black Wagner, etc. It's all there and analyzed with a keen sensitivity to the way that artistic forms produce political and social meaning. The book is encyclopedic, but also incredibly engaging and entertaining to read. It gives a grand overview of modern and modernist culture through the lens of Wagner. So let me just say a word about how things are going to work today. Alex is going to talk for about 30 or 35 minutes, and then I'll lead a discussion with him. Please submit questions to me using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can send questions at any time, even during the talk. Please, though, don't use the chat feature or don't raise your hand. We can't see or hear you. And we'll end promptly at 6. So now I will turn it over to Alex. His title today is The Unforgiven, Wagner, Jews, and Anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much, Maury, for the very kind introduction. And it is wonderful to be invited to this distinguished series to talk about a very charged and difficult question, which is the composer Richard Wagner's relationship with Jewishness, with anti-Semitism, with the ideology of hate that underpinned the Nazi regime, with the Holocaust itself. Wagner is part of these stories to a very disturbing extent. But at the same time, he is a gigantic figure in cultural history who has touched upon and has touched so many different worlds, so many different people of variegated backgrounds, in a way that it becomes, I think, risky to categorize Wagner purely as being aligned with one ideological strain or another, one political strain or another. And the mission that I undertook with this book was to give as expansive and perhaps as contradictory a picture of this phenomenon of Wagnerism, Wagner's influence outside of music on the arts, on literature, on intellectual life, on philosophy, and of course on politics as well, to give as rich and ambiguous a picture, and really, I hope, as faithful, as representative a picture of that influence as I could, to counteract, to some degree, the more limiting perspective that so many people have on Wagner today, which is to equate him entirely with Nazi Germany, entirely with anti-Semitism. And this is really the one thing that people now know about Wagner, is that he was Hitler's favorite composer. And while that is true, and while in no way do I want to push that aspect of the Wagner narrative to the side, it becomes more and more central as the book goes on. I do want to give the rest of the picture and to show how extraordinarily widespread Wagner's influence was at the turn of the last century, including his effect on Jews, on African Americans, on gay people, on feminists, on far left-wing figures, socialists, communists, anarchists, sort of all across the political spectrum, all across the cultural spectrum. And then to ask, how was it that Wagner's image became more and more confined by the darker side of his legacy? And I want to make very clear, I do not think this is a sort of unpleasant accident that happened to him. It is something that he brought on himself. And the superb formulation that I found in the writings of Thomas Mann, which really I think gets to the heart of the problem that we're facing with Wagner, is that Wagner, Thomas Mann once said, Wagner was a passionate and devoted follower or admirer of Wagner, who was also at the same time deeply skeptical of Wagner and had this enormous ambivalence toward Wagner in a way that I personally find to be a model as someone who also listens with great admiration to Wagner's music and also with a great deal of doubt. Anyway, what Mann said was that Wagner lent himself to his own misuse. And so I think that's quite an elegant formulation that on the one hand captures the extent to which Wagner was manipulated, exploited, distorted in Nazi Germany especially, but at the same time he was involved in that process. And his anti-Semitism was absolutely, of course, at the core of the role that he played in subsequent events, the means by which he became such a dark and menacing figure in so many people's minds. Now, there's a slew of very complicated issues to be confronted here, which I have little hope of covering in any detail in half an hour. But I thought I could sort of give a very quick overview of some of the issues, sort of lay out the territory, and then really invite conversation on any points that arrest people's attention or raise questions or objections, and just to continue this conversation, which is so important. And the thing that I would say about Wagner and the questions that hang over Wagner is that this is a very, very old conversation. It's been going on for a very long time. There's nothing new about it. I was actually a little bit amused in recent years, especially as questions were increasingly being asked about famous artists, especially in the sort of popular world and the Me Too movement and quote unquote cancel culture and everything else. So people were asking me, are you worried about Wagner? You've written this big book about Wagner, and now sort of this kind of figure is inviting more scrutiny. And of course, it's certainly not the case that Wagner, just up until recent years, has been beloved and revered, and then suddenly people are asking questions about him. No, the trouble with Wagner began in the 1850s. Already in the 1850s, people were asking, is Wagner too horrible for us to listen to his music? Does it have anything to do with him? And yet somehow he is still here. And so there's something about his work that compels attention and will not go away. I think precisely for that reason, I think it's so valuable for us to continue looking at Wagner and even using this endless debate over Wagner as a model for how we deal with other troubling figures in our cultural history, because, especially in recent decades, a very sophisticated methodology has emerged for analyzing Wagner's anti-Semitism, for analyzing the impact on his works, and then for dealing with sort of how we look at the works, how they are staged in the opera house, and ways in which we can isolate and accentuate those questions, and not to sort of brush them aside. And so there's something in this Wagner analyst Wagner controversy, I think, that is edifying as we gaze with a more skeptical eye at the heritage of Western civilization, which has sort of so many troubling questions behind it in so many ways. So to go back more or less to the beginning, the trouble started in 1850 when Wagner published an essay in the distinguished magazine Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, founded by Robert Schumann, titled Das Judentum in der Musik, Jewishness in Music. This was not out of the blue. It was part of an ongoing debate that had been taking place in that publication and other musical publications about Jewish composers, and especially about Meyerbeer, who had achieved and still held enormous fame as an opera composer. And there was a camp of younger German composers, as well as music historians and critics, who were trying to combat this influence of Meyerbeer and establish space for the radical new so-called new German school of Wagner and Liszt. And so Wagner contributed to this debate. Little of the vocabulary of this essay was new. This idea central to the essay that Jewish people are somehow alien to German musical culture, to sort of cultural European musical culture in general, that it's somehow they betray their otherness as they attempt to master musical speech. This was not a new argument. There was something new about the sheer force, the violence of Wagner's language. And Wagner was a violent writer. He was insistent. He endlessly repeated his slogans and his Stichworte, as the German word is, his buzzwords. He was very good at coining these buzzwords and slogans, and he would just sort of pound away. And so there's an insistence of violence in this essay, which contributed in some way, I think, to the radicalization of anti-Semitism in German discourse in the middle of the 19th century. The essay was noticed, it was talked about, and actually within a few years, I should have mentioned that it was published anonymously under a pseudonym, but Wagner's authorship became known and was actually discussed in England by critics who were very friendly to Mendelssohn's music in particular, and who took great offense at Wagner's critique of Mendelssohn alongside Meyerbeer as a Jewish composer who was somehow not truly German or not sort of truly authentic. And so this is really the beginning of the critique of Wagner's anti-Semitism as something quite dangerous in cultural discourse. But within a few years, discussion had ebbed away, and it really wasn't very widely discussed to begin with, this essay. And if Wagner had left it at that, I think we would be looking at all of these issues in a different way. But he returned to the topic of Jewishness. And particularly important was his decision in 1869 to republish this essay, now under his own name, very widely distributed in a way that called enormous attention to it. And in the process, he added an afterword, which extended the attack on Jews in quite nasty new ways. And his focus was now not so much Jewish composers, but Jewish music critics, especially the critic Hans Lick, who had emerged as his leading skeptic. And from then on, Wagner was known as an anti-Semite and has been known as such ever since. The essay was very controversial. There was a great deal of distress over the essay, including from among Wagner's allies. Just many people found it quite dismaying and repulsive. There was also amusement over this essay. People found it ridiculous in many ways to attack Mendelssohn, who really assumed such a major role in sort of posthumously. It's a very grand status in the musical canon. There were also sort of rumors swirling that Wagner himself might be Jewish, and that this was all some kind of psychological implosion sort of taking place within him, that he was becoming hysterical on the subject of Jews. And I'll show on the screen share here a somewhat disturbing cartoon. Such. And the title here is Darwinistische Entwicklungslehre, Darwinian evolutionary theory. And you can see pretty easily what's happening here. An anti-Semitic stereotype is evolving into the figure of Wagner. It is sort of an anti-Semitic image that also attacks Wagner's anti-Semitism, a rather troubling, complex phenomenon in itself. And so there was this derision of Wagner that was seen, especially in Vienna at the time. Anti-Semitism in 1869 had not achieved the kind of lethal political strength that it would achieve in a fairly short period of time, especially going into the 1880s. And so there was a sense that Wagner's version of anti-Semitism was not quite aligned with the political discourse at the end of the 1860s. But things changed after the crash of 1873. Anti-Semitism really gathered strength as a way of shifting blame onto Jews. Various other forces have contributed to this gathering intensity of anti-Semitism. And the shift from a more religiously or economically based form of anti-Jewishness, and I'm sure you've discussed this kind of shift often in the series, toward this pseudo-scientific, biologically defined notion of Jewish otherness, sort of genetic otherness, which, of course, would become the foundation of eliminationist anti-Semitism in the 20th century. This idea that there was something ineradicably different about Jewish people that no degree of assimilation or conversion would address. Now, a very big question in the discussion of Wagner's anti-Semitism is, did he himself complete this transition from the older form of anti-Semitism to the newer one. And of course, it has to be stressed that the older form of anti-Semitism was by no means innocuous, and thousands, millions of people suffered and died under the force of that version of anti-Semitism. But it is nonetheless an important question. Did Wagner himself undergo completely that evolution? My feeling is that he didn't quite. You can certainly have a sense reading Das Judentum in der Musik that he seems to be seeing Jews as innately other, and no matter how hard they try, they cannot master the language of German art, German music, and there's sort of something in them which cannot be overcome. And that is a sort of troubling early indicator of that kind of biological mentality. But then still in his later writings, which are full of ghastly language borrowed from Gobineau and other racial thinkers, still there's this sense, the suggestion that he throws out that somehow there could be this transfiguration, this sort of transformation that he says would raise even the lowest races upward under the blessed umbrella of the sort of spiritual emanation of a pure Christian idea, the kind of emanation that one might find at Bayreuth, in the Festspielhaus at Bayreuth, at performances of Parsifal. And this is not a very generous concession on Wagner's part by any means, but I think there is a sense that there's that he doesn't quite go all the way in terms of this sort of movement toward the biological anti-Semitism. And of course, there's the fact that he had many Jews around him in Bayreuth, and this gets into another issue of Wagner's own personal relationships with Jews, which are very complicated. And sort of ultimately hard to make sense of in many ways. His Jewish friends and especially subordinate sort of helpers underwent a fair amount of humiliation in his presence, but at the same time, there was a genuine friendship or sort of fondness on Wagner's part, and no one was compelling him to undertake these relationships. There's something very complicated going on. Sort of some of this sort of need to kind of have Jews around him, but also to control them or to sort of put them in subordinate positions. Strange, dark psychological questions with Wagner. Jews were an obsession, a lifelong obsession that he could never let go of, and that sort of at times seemed to sort of dominate his consciousness. And he believed that ultimately Jews were going to be victorious, and that sort of perhaps he felt that when he himself had to submit in some ways to Jewish presence and to sort of control it as much as he could on his own sort of territory. It's difficult to speculate, dangerous to speculate exactly what was going on, but there's something different about it. There's something singular about it, as against so much of the anti-Semitism that you find in Germany and Austria, other European countries in this period. Another great question which arises, a question for which I honestly do not have a fixed answer, is, can one detect anti-Semitism in the works themselves? And there's been a great deal of writing, a great deal of powerful and intelligent scholarship on the question of characters like Alberich, and Mima, the dwarves, the conniving dwarves in the ring, Beckmesser, the conniving Meistersinger, Merker, a musical judge, really sort of a metaphor for music critic in Die Meistersinger, perhaps Klingsor, the evil sorcerer in Parsifal, certainly the figure of Kundry, the mysterious eternal wanderer in Parsifal. Are these Jewish figures? Very early on, there was open speculation on this point, and actually there are protests at early performances of Meistersinger because Jewish opera goers feared that Beckmesser was going to turn out to be a Jewish stereotype. Somehow that idea did not take hold, even though it was sort of in the public arena. And sort of after those early performances, it's very difficult to find commentary on Meistersinger, which brings up this Jewish Beckmesser issue, sort of either in the sort of Jewish world or in the kind of anti-Semitic press and commentary, even right into the Nazi period. You simply don't find it. The scholar David Dennis made a very, very thorough search for such discussions of Beckmesser, could not find them. In the case of Albrecht and Mima, you do see mentions of the idea, including from none other than Gustav Mahler, that these are Jewish caricatures of a sort. But they were not terribly widespread. This was not kind of one of the dominant lenses through which people viewed the work of Wagner. It's really only in the post-World War II era, the post-Holocaust era, that the question of Jewishness in the Wagner operas has come to the fore. The great philosopher Theodor Adorno was one of the first to advance this idea when he said all of the outcasts in Wagner's work are Jews. And then, sort of, as I mentioned, a number of significant scholars have taken up this issue in recent decades. The question remains unsettled. It's a very powerful and plausible idea, but because there's no evidence that Wagner intended it, and Wagner was not the kind of person who kept his intentions to himself, we sort of have to assume that this was either a secretive or even a kind of unconscious intention on his part, which may be so. I think there is something there, but I find it very difficult to pin down and to be sort of absolutely certain about. And I'm hesitant when people sort of take it as sort of absolutely obvious and proven that the Wagner operas are anti-Semitic, that they contain anti-Semitic caricatures. I think that's going too far. And in terms of Wagner's relationship with Nazism, I don't think this is something that I'm going to sort of go into in any detail, because this is sort of a huge question in and of itself. But I think it's worth noting that in terms of the particular rhetoric of Wagner's anti-Semitism, it was not one of the primary sources on which the Nazis drew for their kind of anti-Semitic sort of anthologies of kind of sort of anti-Semitic writings. Jewishness in music would be there. Goebbels would quote one of the late essays on occasion, Wagner saying that the Jews are the plastic demon of the downfall of mankind, whatever that means exactly. Hitler never quoted Wagner on the subject of Jews. He never made any mention of Wagner's anti-Semitism. He undoubtedly knew that Wagner was anti-Semitic. He undoubtedly had read the essay, but he didn't find it useful to quote Wagner on these points. And I think the reason for that, the sort of surprising sort of sense that in Nazi Germany, Wagner is not a sort of titan of anti-Semitic thought, is that his writing is strange, confusing, contradictory, bewildering, and sort of lacking in the kind of cretinous clarity that you find in sort of anti-Semitic writing of a later period. It was more useful. Wagner was more useful to the Nazis as this grand cultural figurehead who seemed in some way or another to anticipate Nazi Germany, to sort of herald the sort of hyper-nationalist Nazi German state, sort of rather than a sort of more precise precursor. And particularly with respect to anti-Semitic ideology. There were some Nazis who disliked Wagner, who found him sort of an inauthentic anti-Semite. They found him decadent, questionable on various grounds. And in previous periods, there were a number of anti-Semites, including Eugen Dühring and Paul de la Garde, who could not abide Wagner and found him to be repulsive and sort of useless to their movement. And so by saying all this, I'm not trying to separate Wagner from the history of anti-Semitism. He is there. He plays an important role, but I think it's a slightly more marginal position than a kind of typical short presentation of the matter would have you think. That sort of Wagner was Hitler's favorite composer. Wagner sort of dictated anti-Semitism to Hitler, that he was sort of an absolutely formative presence. I think to sort of assign too much responsibility to Wagner is to let everyone else off the hook in a way. And the roots of anti-Semitism go very, very deep, back centuries, not just in German culture and history, but European culture and history, Christian history, and around the world. And so Wagner plays a role, but not quite as large a role as I think some would have you think. The last matter that I want to touch on before taking up any of your questions is, in a way, the most interesting one, and the one that I spend the most time on in the book, which is Jewish Wagnerites. There were a great many of them, not just those who were directly around Wagner in Bayreuth and in as many other places that he lived throughout his life, but in the audience, among some of the most vociferous, enthusiastic Wagner fans, and in later generations, through especially sort of the fin du siècle period, a great many enthusiasts, not necessarily worshippers, but enthusiasts, people who took Wagner seriously and found him inspiring or sort of thought-provoking one way or another. One of them was Theodor Herzl, as I talk about in the book. And a sort of remarkable moment in the history of Jewish Wagnerism is when Herzl was in Paris in 1896, writing Der Judenstaat, the sort of founding document of the Zionist state, the prospectus of the Zionist state. And at the same time, Wagner's Tannhäuser is playing at the opera in Paris. And Herzl goes to see it every time it's staged throughout its run. And he says in his diary that only on the nights when the opera was not performed did he lack inspiration, lack conviction for what he was doing, for what he was writing. And so there's a sense in which, by his own testimony, the music of Tannhäuser is emboldening, is empowering Herzl as he works. And this is something that we find very often at the turn of the century, sort of throughout the late 19th century into the early 20th century, especially younger people who go to Wagner and feel what W.E.B. Du Bois, another Wagnerian enthusiast, called a movement of power, a sense of movement of power within the spectator, and a sense of visions of future possibility, future greatness, sort of a feeling that one's ambitions are mirrored back to oneself in more heightened form as one listens to Wagner and sees Wagner. And of course, this mechanism can take a much darker form. Adolf Hitler was exactly one of those young people who felt vague feelings of future greatness when he first started seeing Wagner operas in Linz. But nonetheless, it's just a very widespread phenomenon. And you find it with Jewish Wagnerites. And it isn't necessarily a case of sort of the the tortured or self-hating Jew. There's been a lot of discourse about Jewish self-hatred and a lot of critiques of the idea of Jewish self-hatred back and forth. Obviously, Wagner is a kind of very promising territory in which to pursue that theme. And you do find a number of Jews who are very conservative, who are seeking to sort of assimilate themselves completely, who are disgusted by their Jewishness and want to somehow erase it from their being. And listening to Wagner, becoming absorbed in Wagner, is part of that mechanism of sort of transforming themselves. And there's the very dark story of the philosopher Otto Weininger, who killed himself at a very young age after writing what would become the best-selling tract, Sex and Character, a racist and misogynist document of just startling strangeness as we revisit it now. He was also gay. And so the phenomenon of the self-hating Jewish Wagnerite is real. And actually, novelists and playwrights made fun of such a figure. You find it in Karl Sternheim and Schnitzler and some others. But then you have others who were not in a sort of state of psychological agony and torment as they listened to Wagner. Herzl certainly seems to be one of those. And of course, there are questions with Herzl about his relationship with Eastern European Jewishness and his urge to sort of distance himself from sort of certain forms of Jewish culture. Yes, but I don't think anyone can realistically describe Herzl as a self-hating Jew. And again, sort of Wagner was he didn't seem to view Wagner purely as an anti-Semite, even as he was very aware of Wagner's anti-Semitism. It was a separation that he could make in his mind. And you find that with a number of other Jewish Wagnerites. And so this is something where I think we need to look at the past, especially with a certain compassion and a certain sophistication, and not with a kind of extreme self-righteous judgmentalism. In the introduction of the book, I mentioned the late critic Michael Andre Bernstein and his idea of backshadowing, this idea that we evaluate the literature of the pre-Holocaust era, and he was talking specifically about Jewish literature in this case, through the lens of what came after, and judging sort of figures of this period by whether or not they were sensitive to rising anti-Semitism, or whether they were oblivious to it. And so I think in the same way, when we look at Jewish Wagnerism, we need to see its many varieties, and we need to realize that no one, or almost no one, had any idea of what was coming. And anti-Semitism was simply not one of the really defining characteristics that people would name attached to Wagner in that period. It was something that a lot of people were embarrassed by, and just would sort of prefer not to talk about. It was very important, and it was very important in the radical anti-Semitic circles. But with this book, I'm essentially presenting a vast and unresolved question of what do we do with this titanic and troubling figure and his legacy, and the sort of all the contradictory aspects of his legacy. And Wagner and Jews and anti-Semitism is really the most obvious case study of Wagner's questionableness, of his sort of problematic nature. But there are many. It takes many other forms, and I think there is a reason why Wagner is still with us. And what I end up saying at the end of the book is that a kind of demystification takes place with Wagner. No one who's sensible and rational can any longer put Wagner on some kind of pedestal and sort of worship him and sort of treat him as a sort of a pure emanation of a higher sphere. We cannot forget the history. We cannot forget the context. But I think that's very healthy to always sort of treat art as a historical and human phenomenon, and not to separate it, and not to sort of elevate it and abstract it. And I think in our own culture, in American culture, we have problems with our veneration of certain cultural figures, a veneration of our own popular culture, which we tend to think of as pure and innocent and sort of coming up from the sort of people, and sort of combating the elite and aristocracy and sort of power and so on and so forth. But in fact, there are deep troubling questions about our own cultural legacy, and the sort of idea that I place at the end of the book is especially that we as Americans have a great deal to learn from the case of Wagner, the famous case of Wagner, as we look at ourselves and as we look at our own problematic cultural inheritance. So on that point, I will come to an end, and would be happy to field any and all questions. It's Wagner. No one is going to have any questions.
Exactly. No, there are a lot of questions already. So I will try to synthesize them. And that was fantastic. So thank you so much for that. I think you really gave us a lot to think about, and a great way to kind of, think about the question, the problem of Wagner. So to start out, I think, can you say a little bit more about the context for the essay, for the 1850 Das Judentum in der Musik essay? So why exactly did he have it in for Meyerbeer? I mean, Meyerbeer was nice to him in a lot of ways. Like, where was all this hatred coming from?
Yeah, well, I sort of skipped over the question of the origins of Wagner's own anti-Semitism before 1850. And it was sort of creeping to the forefront, I think, in the 1840s. There was a lot of anti-Semitism on the left. And so Wagner was a part of the left in the 1840s and participated in the revolutions of 1848 and had to leave Germany in 1849 and spent more than a decade in exile. As he was aligned with sort of democratic ideas and sort of revolutionary ideas, at the same time, he was picking up anti-Semitism from figures on the left. And of course, we have the issue of Karl Marx's own essay on the Jewish question, the far less radical kind of anti-Jewish language that you find there. So it was circulating. And it's like that may have been sort of some of the context in which Wagner was first picking up this discourse. But then it was fused with his personal obsessions and resentments. And so this is where Meyerbeer comes into the picture. He left Germany in 1849. Shortly after, he saw Meyerbeer's Le Prophète in Paris, and it was a huge success, and he was enraged. And I think the sort of contrast between Meyerbeer's ongoing success as a German composer who had settled in Paris, and his own failure and sort of outsider status set off some kind of rage in him. I think so. I would say that the sort of anti-Semitism was already becoming part of his discourse, but sort of it was that point, that kind of jealousy, which became radicalized. But it wasn't just about Meyerbeer. He just fell into a psychological habit of blaming Jews, scapegoating Jews for his own setbacks, which are so often created by his own profligacy and combativeness and sort of general sort of messiness in terms of how he dealt with the world. He would find a way to blame Jews for those setbacks, and this became a recurring kind of psychological obsession. So it was kind of a mix of these sort of environmental forces kind of working around him, and his own sort of compulsion, personal compulsion, coming to the fore. And it's that compulsion which gives that essay and sort of all the subsequent sort of writings on Jews, it's what makes them so disturbing, because it's not a theory, it's not an ideology. It's a passion. This is something that comes from very deep within him, and he confessed that in a letter to Liszt. It's vital to him. He needs this hatred. It fuels him, and you find this in other artistic figures. When anti-Semitism comes to the fore, you find it in T.S. Eliot. It's very disturbing to see anti-Semitism becoming part of the creative process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you also sort of, so it seems to me like, there's this phenomenon here of a kind of relation to capitalism. The Jews are kind of representing this sort of relation to capitalism that's inspiring a lot of intense emotions, not just in him, but, in other people too, including a certain kind of ambivalence too. So they're kind of desiring this sort of new relationship to the market at the same time that they're sort of hating that in themselves. Mm-hmm. So a few questions about the essay itself. So someone asked whether, isn't it true that he gives some praise for, I'll maybe ask these three questions together and you can, answer them if you want. So isn't it true that he gives some praise for Jewish virtuosic instrumentalists at the same time as he heaps invective on composers like Meyerbeer, and although he doesn't name them, my memory is he doesn't name Meyerbeer, but it's
he doesn't, which is sort of all the more cowardly that he wrote this anonymous essay attacking Meyerbeer without naming Meyerbeer, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about.
And then, so isn't it true that he has some admiration for Jewish performers?
Mildly. I mean, virtuosity is a charged word. It can become sort of mere virtuosity, kind of mere mechanical brilliance, which is soulless. And he said the same thing about Italian opera. There's this sort of brilliant display that's meaningless, and covers up kind of cultural vacancy, and it's not kind of the true hearty voice of the folk. It's sort of this sort of aristocratic frippery, and so he has sort of mild praise, but I wouldn't put sort of too much emphasis on that. He also praises to a degree Börne and Heine, really for being so scathing toward themselves, sort of becoming models of Jewish self-hatred, sort of almost. And so that's another, and he did. I mean, he could never bring himself to fully praise Heine, but he took an enormous amount from Heine and sort of elements, so many elements of the early operas, Flying Dutchman and Tannhäuser in particular, come from Heine. And I think there was. I think the essay is trying to sound like Heine in some way. It is sort of attempting to sort of model itself on this brilliant polemic that Heine and Börne both practiced, and that he just falls short because it's just not funny. I mean, it's not funny because of everything that came after. It's just not. It's not good comic writing by any standard, and it's relentless, and it's kind of plodding and ponderous, and so it's. But I think there was some emulation, hidden emulation there.
So, in the essay, he says not only that Jews are alien to German culture, but he also implies that they're incapable of producing real art, right? Mm-hmm. That they can only ever imitate or kind of parody. And, so there's a question about whether, that's definitely a trope that you see in later anti-Semites. So like, I'm thinking of someone like Drummond, at the end of the 19th century, and certainly, into the 20th. So, but do you know whether that's new with Wagner? Is he?
It's not new. I mean, Franz Brendel, the editor of the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, had said the same thing in an earlier essay. I think also Theodor Uhlig, another especially Theodor Uhlig, rather than Brendel, had said, really made the same claim about Jewish musicians, Jewish composers in an earlier essay that had set off this debate. Then there was another critic, Ludwig Bischoff, who was defending Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer and saying this anti-Jewishness is ridiculous, and and sort of heading back in that degree. And so that's where Wagner stepped in. But no, this point had already been made specifically about Jewish composers. But Wagner fleshed it out, certainly. He went on at greater length, and he that vehemence, that repetitiveness, kind of solidified this idea. It was no longer something that had been thrown out in passing in the middle of this back and forth debate, infighting among kind of German music critics and commentators. The essay was just long enough that it just became a statement on its own, and people forgot about the context of the various sort of polemics back and forth, especially when it was republished. Then all of that prior discussion had disappeared, and so although I wouldn't say that there's anything particularly original about the content of the claims that Wagner is making in terms of the sweeping cultural attack on Jews as infiltrators, as imposters in German culture, the scale on which he carried it out. That was.
Yeah, and quickly, there was a question about like how far he went. Did he call for extermination? I know Cosima she even goes, she goes pretty far too. But how far does his anti-Semitism go?
I think there have been claims that, especially the ending of this essay, where he calls for der Untergang. The Untergang is a complicated German word. Going under is the literal translation. It also means kind of downfall, destruction. But it could also be sort of a philosophical idea of sort of this kind of downfall that turns into this transformation. Hegel and sort of others sort of use the concept this way. It's sort of hard to read, and so it can be read in several different ways. I think in the context, it seems as though Wagner is in fact talking about not quite sort of assimilation, but this idea that he returns to is sort of at the end in his later essays, some kind of apocalyptic spiritual transformation, which somehow just solve this problem, and it can seem menacing, but I think to equate it with the Holocaust, to equate it with a sort of genocidal program makes no sense whatsoever in this context, and no one treated it as such. You don't find Nazi theorists sort of citing the ending of this essay, but it's chilling, just because of the way it ends with this word which sort of clangs out on the page. It's the vehemence of it is disturbing. Later, it emerged when Cosima's diaries were published that he had joked about the terrible theater fire in Vienna, where hundreds of people died, including many Jews, and he had sort of joked about it and said something to the effect of all Jews should be burned at a performance of Nathan the Wise. An utterly horrible thing to say. But again, to sort of go from there to sort of he's plotting the Holocaust, I think, is to go too far. And so he had violent fantasies and sort of violent thoughts. But it just in no way, I think, can you really collect these sort of scattered utterances into a program. Of course, this was a remark that emerged in the 1970s and sort of had nothing to do with sort of earlier history.
So I was really fascinated by your discussion of Afro-Wagnerism, and the fascination of prominent Black intellectuals for Wagner, especially W.E.B. Du Bois, who you described going to Bayreuth in 1936, and so can you say a little bit more about that and did Du Bois, like, was he aware of Wagner's anti-Semitism? Did he comment on it? Like, how did?
Yeah, it's a fascinating case. And this sort of emerged as I was working on this chapter of the book where I talk about Wagner, race and racism, the 6th chapter of the book. It was originally really going to be all about the Jewish question. And I thought I'd mention Black Wagnerites as well, because I was aware of Du Bois and his love of Wagner. But then it sort of took on greater weight for me as I explored more of Du Bois and his commentary on Wagner, and as I found other figures, other Black figures, intellectuals and artists who had a relationship with Wagner, Alan Locke, Shirley Graham, who later married Du Bois. Langston Hughes was very fond of Tristan. Ralph Ellison in his youth listened to Wagner, and so it was something of a motif, among sort of Black intellectuals of a certain generation. And so I was curious about, so what did they find in Wagner? And then I discovered this extraordinary figure of Lorana Aldridge, the contralto, who was contracted to sing at Bayreuth in 1896. She was the daughter of the great Black Shakespearean actor Ira Aldridge. And despite the fact that Cosima was, if anything, more racist than her husband, she was going to sing one of the Valkyries in the Ring at Bayreuth in 1896 until she fell sick. And I was able to reconstruct her story in a way that sort of hadn't been done before. And so I began to feel that this was actually a bigger theme and should have a bigger presence in this chapter. But of course, Du Bois is at the heart of it. And really what's going on with Du Bois is this sort of mechanism that I discussed earlier of a figure from another background, not a white German, nonetheless finding inspiration in Wagner's mythic apparatus and seeing how this brilliant modernization of myth that takes place in Wagner's operas, especially The Ring, could be emulated. And so it's about emulation. And so what he talks about with Wagner is he sees a sort of future great Black art which sort of uses the mythic past, especially sort of African myths and legends, as Wagner used Nordic and Germanic legends. I wonder whether Du Bois might have been impressed by the film Black Panther in this regard, because sort of this is something of what's happening in that case. But in any event, it was that. I think there was also a slightly kind of insolent or defiant element to Du Bois sort of stepping in and saying, "This is mine." These masterpieces of white Western civilization also belong to me. I can take them, I can make use of them, convert them to my own ends. I think that's something also what's going on with Herzl, and so there's a certain defiance and pride in how he takes hold of Wagner. And then this extraordinary story that appears in the Souls of Black Folk of the coming of John. Very, Du Bois didn't write that much fiction, but this is an extraordinary story. And the crucial scene in it is this young Black man has gone to school and envisions his sort of future kind of progress in the world and becoming educated and becoming sort of, it's a commentary on Booker T. Washington style kind of, Black improvement and sort of betterment. And then there's this catastrophe where he's at a concert and the usher taps him on the shoulder and says he has to leave. The white woman sitting next to him has become uncomfortable by his presence. Then it turns out this woman is with this white childhood friend of his. So the whole kind of story sort of spirals toward disaster. But as he's listening to the music, and it's Wagner's Lohengrin, the Prelude to Lohengrin, he has this vision of some other worlds that could be achieved, that he could sort of step into, and it's denied to him. And at the end of the story, he's about to be lynched, but the music is still running through his head. And I don't think Du Bois, there's an ironic aspect to this, but there's also, I think, a sense, and when Du Bois talks about Wagner, he talks about he's transported by Wagner, and it's sort of there's a vision here of something in which one can believe and one can trust, that we can sort of carry with us, and that can sort of inform our own struggles toward a better future. And so it's it's not a sort of sardonic or sort of purely ironic sort of circumstance that he's setting up. It's just it's a sort of tragic one rather than ironic, but it's quite powerful, and it's just sort of another just very surprising, unexpected way in which Wagner plays a role in the culture of this period, the fin de siècle.
Wow. All right. Well, we're out of time. We have, 20 more questions from the audience, and I had 20 more. So I feel like we could have gone on for hours, but I think we have to leave it there, unfortunately. And thank you so much for this. It was really, I just thought, fascinating, and I recommend to everyone to get the book. I also want to do a pitch for our last program, which is going to be in 2 weeks. It was going to be in 1 week, but it's actually going to be in 2 weeks, which is a discussion with Jake McCauley about his new book, The House of Fragile Things. So mark your calendars for that. And again, thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate your coming. So, and
a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to everyone in the audience.